A white police officer shoots a black teenager wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, but he has no idea the boy he just killed is his own son. How could a moment of fear and prejudice lead to such a devastating revelation? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where a split-second decision changed everything, or seen someone else face the unbearable consequences of misunderstanding and bias? This is a story about heartbreak, hidden truths, and the struggle for justice in a divided world. Stay with us to uncover the shocking twists that unfold. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The cool autumn air clung to the quiet streets of Maple Street, where dim streetlights cast long shadows over cracked sidewalks. Despite the stillness, there was a tension woven into the fabric of this neighborhood, a history of racial conflict and unspoken mistrust that lingered like an unseen specter. Officer Ethan Cooper, a veteran policeman with a rigid demeanor, walked his usual patrol route. His badge gleamed under the pale glow of the streetlights, but the weight it carried wasn't just professional. Years on the force had ingrained in him a hyper-awareness of danger, and the incidents he'd witnessed in this area had left their mark. The memory of an ambush years ago, where a fellow officer barely survived, surfaced unbidden as he turned the corner. His hand instinctively brushed against his holstered weapon. Across the street, a figure caught his eye. A teenage boy stood near an old apartment building, partially hidden by the shadows. His black shirt, emblazoned with bold BLM letters, stood out starkly against the muted backdrop. The boy's posture was a mix of defiance and unease, his shoulders squared, but his gaze flicking nervously between passing cars and the ground beneath his sneakers. Ethan hesitated. The sight of the shirt, a symbol that carried weight and sparked controversy, stirred something within him. Was the boy making a statement, or was this a prelude to trouble? Years of training urged him to approach, to assess, to take control before anything could escalate. Taking a deep breath, Ethan crossed the street, his boots crunching against the pavement. The boy, Jamal Harris, noticed him immediately. His body stiffened as his eyes met Ethan's. "Hey," Ethan called out, keeping his tone firm but neutral. "Everything okay over here?" Jamal didn't respond right away. His hands stayed in his pockets, his gaze guarded. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice low but steady. Ethan's eyes flicked to the shirt, then back to Jamal's face. "It's late. What are you doing out here by yourself?" "I'm waiting for my mom," Jamal replied, his tone tinged with a mix of defiance and wariness. "She's supposed to pick me up." The pause that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full charged with history, suspicion, and unspoken words. Ethan took a step closer, his posture imposing, though he didn't mean it to be. Jamal shifted his weight, but didn't back away. "You know," Ethan began, gesturing subtly toward the shirt. "Wearing something like that around here can draw attention. People might misunderstand your intentions." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "What's there to misunderstand? I'm just standing here." Ethan felt the sting of the boy's words, but pressed on. "I've seen things get out of hand before," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Just trying to make sure you're not putting yourself in a bad situation." Jamal's jaw clenched. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said firmly. "I'm just waiting." The boy's tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Ethan felt a flicker of irritation, mixed with something else, an unease he couldn't quite place. "Mind if I see some ID?" Ethan asked, the request sharp and automatic. Jamal's shoulders tensed further. "Why? I'm not breaking any laws." Ethan hesitated. He could feel the tension growing, could sense the boy's distrust building with every second. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about Jamal's unwavering gaze unsettled him. "It's just protocol," Ethan said finally. Jamal huffed but reached into his back pocket, moving slowly. Ethan's hand instinctively hovered near his holster. "Careful," Ethan said, his voice dropping. Jamal froze, his hand still halfway to his pocket. His eyes locked on Ethan's hand near the weapon, and the air between them thickened. "I'm just getting my ID," Jamal said evenly, though his voice carried an edge now. "That's what you wanted, right?" Ethan nodded but didn't relax. Jamal pulled out his wallet and handed over the ID with deliberate slowness. Ethan scanned it, his jaw tightening as he read the details. 15 years old, local address, nothing out of the ordinary. "All right," Ethan said, handing it back. "You can't blame me for being cautious." Jamal took the ID, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I can blame you for treating me like a criminal when I'm just standing here," he said bluntly. Ethan's brow furrowed, the boy's words striking deeper than he expected. "It's not like that," he countered, though even to his own ears, The words sounded weak. Sure feels like it, Jamal shot back. The exchange hung in the air, crackling with unresolved tension. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a car slowly rolled past, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Both turned their heads toward the vehicle, their bodies instinctively tensing. Ethan glanced back at Jamal. The boy hadn't moved, but his expression had shifted. There was fear now, barely hidden behind his defiant exterior. Ethan felt a pang of guilt, though he didn't fully understand why. "Look," Ethan said finally, his tone softer but still firm. "I'll stay here until your mom shows up, just to make sure everything's okay." Jamal studied him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. "Fine." The two stood in an uneasy silence, the distance between them small but vast. The street was quiet again, but the tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. Ethan's hand rested on his belt, while Jamal kept his eyes on the ground, occasionally glancing up at the man who now stood as both protector and potential threat. Neither could have known how the night would spiral from this moment, how one decision could unravel lives and expose truths neither was ready to face. As the minutes dragged on, the weight of their unspoken fears and assumptions pressed down on them both, setting the stage for what was to come. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his voice measured but firm. "You said you're waiting for your mom. Is that right?" Jamal nodded, his tone clipped. "Yeah. She said she'd be here soon." Ethan's gaze lingered on the bold letters across Jamal's chest. The shirt was impossible to ignore, and the weight of its message clashed with Ethan's instincts to assess every situation critically. "What's her ETA?" Ethan pressed, keeping his expression neutral. Jamal shrugged, glancing down the street. "Not long." There was something in the boy's tone, a faint edge of defiance, but also an underlying nervousness. Ethan noticed Jamal's hands tightening slightly inside his jacket pockets. "You mind taking your hands out of there?" Ethan asked, his voice sharpening just a notch. Jamal hesitated, his lips pressing into a firm line. Slowly, he pulled his hands out, palms open at his sides. "I wasn't hiding anything," he said pointedly. "I didn't say you were," Ethan replied, but the tension in his posture betrayed his unease. Jamal exhaled sharply. "It's the shirt, isn't it?" His words sliced through the brittle silence between them. "You see this? And now you think I'm trouble." Ethan froze for a moment, his jaw tightening. "That's not what this is about," he said, though his voice faltered slightly. Jamal took a small step forward, his eyes narrowing. "No? Then why are you standing here questioning me like I've done something wrong?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no immediate answer came. His mind spun, trying to reconcile his duty with the growing knot in his stomach. "I'm just making sure everything's fine," he said finally, though even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. Jamal didn't miss a beat. "Would you be doing the same if I wasn't wearing this?" He gestured to his shirt, his voice tinged with frustration. Ethan's throat tightened. The question hit harder than he'd expected. His gaze flicked to the street, the shadows stretching further as the night deepened. Memories of a violent confrontation years ago flooded back an ambush in this very neighborhood, his partner bleeding on the pavement, surrounded by chaos. His breath hitched slightly as he pushed the thought aside. "I've seen things go sideways before," Ethan said, his tone firmer now, almost defensive. "This isn't about your shirt or you. It's about making sure nothing happens." Jamal shook his head, his expression both incredulous and exasperated. "You mean making sure I don't do anything, right?" Ethan's grip on his belt tightened. "That's not fair," he shot back. "You don't know me." "And you don't know me," Jamal countered. "But here you are, treating me like a threat because of how I look." The words landed like a gut punch. Ethan wanted to argue, to push back, but the boy's accusation stirred something deeper, a nagging awareness he couldn't shake. Was that why he'd approached Jamal so quickly? Was his reaction rooted in the years of warnings, assumptions, and fears drilled into him by the badge? "I'm not treating you like anything," Ethan said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Jamal crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Then let me stand here and wait, without you staring at me like I'm about to do something." Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. Every instinct told him to take control, to ask more questions, to make sure nothing was amiss. But another part of him, the part buried beneath layers of training and habit, whispered that Jamal was just a kid. His partner's voice echoed in his memory, words from years ago when they'd responded to a call that went horribly wrong. "You hesitate, and it could cost you everything." That mantra had kept him alive, but now it felt like a chain around his neck. "Look," Ethan said, his tone softer but strained. I'm not here to give you a hard time. I just want to be sure you're safe. Jamal's eyebrows shot up. Safe from what? You. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, he didn't have an answer. His hand hovered near his holster again, a reflex he couldn't seem to suppress. Jamal's gaze darted to the movement, and the flicker of fear in the boy's eyes twisted something deep in Ethan's chest. Look, this isn't about me versus you, Ethan said, his voice hardening again. This neighborhood has history. You might not know it, but I do. Jamal stepped closer, his voice rising. And I know what happens when people like me meet people like you. So don't talk to me about history. Ethan's face darkened. Watch your tone, kid, he warned, the authority in his voice returning. Why? Afraid I might say something you don't want to hear? Jamal shot back, his words cutting like knives. The two stood inches apart now, both visibly tense. Ethan's mind raced. He was supposed to de-escalate situations like this, but every word exchanged seemed to drag them further into confrontation. His training told him to establish control, but his conscience warned him that pushing too hard could make everything worse. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic. Ethan's jaw worked as he tried to find the right words, but they eluded him. Do you always assume the worst? Jamal asked finally, his voice quieter, but no less pointed. Ethan met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw past the defiance. He saw the fear, the frustration, the exhaustion of someone too young to carry such burdens. I don't assume, Ethan said, though the words felt like a lie even as they left his mouth. Jamal didn't respond. He just stared at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Finally, Ethan exhaled slowly. All right, he said, stepping back. I'll give you some space, but I'm staying nearby until your mom gets here. Jamal's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension between them remained palpable. Whatever, he muttered, looking away. As Ethan stepped to the side, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He'd done his job, hadn't he? Yet, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. The minutes stretched on, the quiet punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant car horn. Ethan glanced at Jamal, who was now staring at his phone, his face unreadable. The boy didn't trust him that much was clear, but the truth that unsettled Ethan most was that he wasn't sure he trusted himself either. Jamal stood under the streetlight, scrolling through his phone with visibly stiffened shoulders. Ethan paced a few steps away, his eyes darting between Jamal and the quiet street. The air between them was thick with unease. From the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed movement down the street. A small group of teenagers, about the same age as Jamal, was approaching. Their voices were low at first, but as they neared, Ethan caught snippets of their conversation. Yo, that's Jamal, one of them said, nudging another. Another boy pulled out his phone and began recording. Man, don't trust that cop, he called out. You don't know what he's gonna do. Ethan's jaw clenched. The group's presence shifted the dynamic instantly. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, their whispers amplifying his own rising tension. The phone pointed in his direction made his neck stiffen further. Jamal noticed them too and shook his head. I'm good, guys, he called back, his voice louder now. Just waiting for my mom. But one of the teens wasn't convinced. Yeah, right, that's how it always starts, he muttered, loud enough for Ethan to hear. Ethan turned toward the group, his tone sharp. You all need to back up and give us some space. The comment only seemed to embolden them. One boy stepped closer, his phone still raised. Why? So you can mess with him without anyone seeing? Jamal raised his hands, his voice firm but strained. Guys, stop. You're not helping. The tension ramped up another notch. Ethan could feel his heart pounding, the adrenaline pushing him into high alert. The way the group clustered together, their phones raised, created a sense of being surrounded, judged. His hand inched toward his holster, not quite gripping the weapon, but resting near it. Listen, Ethan said, directing his words at Jamal now. You need to stay right where you are, okay? Let's not make this any harder than it has to be. Jamal frowned, his frustration boiling over. Harder? I'm not doing anything. He gestured toward the group. And they're just making sure you don't try something. Try something. Ethan's voice rose, his frustration slipping through. I'm trying to make sure nobody here does something stupid. The boy with the phone laughed bitterly. Yeah, because we're the problem, right? Enough! Ethan snapped, his voice cutting through the rising noise. His hand was fully on his holster now, his body rigid. Jamal turned to Ethan, his own anger barely contained. Why do you keep reaching for your gun? No one's doing anything to you. I told you to stay still, Ethan barked, his voice sharper than he intended. The group behind Jamal bristled, their whispers growing louder. Jamal exhaled heavily, trying to diffuse the moment. All right, fine. I'll stay right here. I'm not moving, okay? He spread his arms wide, palms open. But even as he tried to comply, his tone carried a sharpness that Ethan couldn't ignore. Combined with the jeers from the group behind him, it all felt like it was spiraling out of control. Suddenly, Jamal took a single step forward, his hand still raised. Listen, man. Ethan's hand flew to his weapon, his instincts screaming danger. Don't move, he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. Jamal froze mid-step, his eyes widening in shock. I'm not. The rest of his words were drowned out by the deafening crack of a gunshot. For a moment, everything stood still. The group of teenagers fell silent, their eyes darting between Ethan and Jamal. Jamal stumbled backward, a look of disbelief etched on his face. His hand instinctively reached for his stomach, where a dark stain was spreading across his BLM shirt. He crumpled to the ground, the sound of his body hitting the pavement shattering the brief silence. Ethan's gun trembled in his hand as reality crashed down on him. His chest heaved, his mind reeling. What just happened? The group of teenagers erupted into chaos. Shouts filled the air as one of them bolted toward Jamal, dropping to his knees beside him. Jamal, stay with us, man. You shot him. Another boy screamed, pointing at Ethan. You just shot him for no reason. Ethan stumbled back, his weapon still in his hand. His heart pounded violently, drowning out the shouting voices around him. He looked down at Jamal, the boy's face pale and his breaths shallow. The bright, bold letters on his shirt, Black Lives Matter, seemed to glare at Ethan, a cruel reminder of what this moment would symbolize. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The teenagers continued shouting, some filming, others screaming into their phones for help. He's dying. Hurry up. Ethan's legs felt like lead. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of the gun in his hand was unbearable. Slowly, he lowered it, his fingers trembling as he holstered it. Why? One of the boys shouted, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't doing anything. Ethan tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Jamal's face, now contorted with pain, and the enormity of his mistake crushed him. The ambulance pulled up, its flashing lights illuminating the scene. Paramedics rushed out, pushing through the gathered crowd to reach Jamal. Ethan stepped aside, his body moving mechanically, as though disconnected from his mind. The crowd was growing, drawn by the commotion and flashing lights. People shouted over one another, their voices blending into a roar of outrage. Justice for Jamal! Someone yelled, and the chant caught on, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Ethan stood frozen, watching as the paramedics worked to stabilize Jamal. The scene felt surreal, like he was watching it happen to someone else. But the blood on the pavement told him it was all too real. As Jamal was loaded onto a stretcher, one of the paramedics glanced at Ethan, their expression a mix of disgust and pity. Ethan's chest tightened, shame and confusion twisting inside him. The crowd surged closer, their chants growing louder. What did he do? Say his name. This has to stop. Ethan backed away slowly, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. He'd made a split-second decision, but now, faced with the consequences, he couldn't reconcile the fear that had driven him to pull the trigger. The sound of the ambulance doors slamming shut snapped him out of his stupor. As the vehicle sped off, the weight of what he'd done settled fully on his shoulders. The crowd was closing in now, their anger palpable. Ethan looked around, realizing there was no way to escape the judgment of the moment. The night had started with unease, but now it had erupted into a tragedy that would ripple far beyond Maple Street. His radio crackled to life, but the noise barely registered. All Ethan could hear was Jamal's voice echoing in his mind. Why do you keep reaching for your gun? The answer felt impossibly far away, and yet it haunted him. The flashing red and blue lights from the ambulance faded into the distance, but the scene on Maple Street only grew more chaotic. The crowd, now swollen with neighbors, bystanders, and friends of Jamal, surged closer to Ethan. Voices clashed in a storm of anger and grief. You killed him! A young woman shouted, her phone held high, recording Ethan's every move. He was just a kid. An older man pushed his way to the front, his face a mask of sorrow. Jamal was waiting for his mother. That's all. Why didn't you just talk to him? Ethan stood frozen, the weight of their accusations crashing down like a tidal wave. His hand hovered near his holster instinctively, but he forced it away, knowing any sudden move could ignite the crowd further. His chest tightened as he scanned the faces around him, faces filled with fury, disbelief, and heartbreak. A boy from the group that had been with Jamal earlier pointed an accusing finger at Ethan. "This is why we don't trust you. You didn't even give him a chance. Ethan's voice cracked, his throat dry. More phones appeared, recording every second of his silence. Some people shouted directly at him. Others turned to each other, their murmurs heavy with judgment. "This has to stop. When will it end?" He didn't have to shoot. Through the chaos, an elderly woman stepped forward. Her voice cut through the noise, steady but trembling. "Please," she said, addressing the crowd. "He's just a boy. He didn't deserve this." For a brief moment, the crowd quieted. All eyes turned to her as she gestured toward the dark stain on the pavement where Jamal had fallen. "That child," she continued, her voice cracking with emotion, "could have been anyone's son. But now, he's gone." The silence broke again with cries of anger. "And it's his fault!" someone yelled, pointing at Ethan. Ethan's body felt heavy, his limbs unresponsive. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. All he could hear was the echo of the gunshot in his mind, followed by Jamal's voice. "I'm just waiting for my mom." The radio on his shoulder crackled, pulling him out of his trance. "Officer Cooper," a voice said, sharp and urgent. "Return to the station immediately. The chief wants you back." "Now." Ethan nodded numbly, though no one could see it. He turned toward his patrol car, but the crowd moved with him, their shouts growing louder. "Running away? Answer for what you did. Say his name." The chants grew louder, a unified cry of pain and anger. Ethan climbed into his car, the door slamming shut behind him. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The drive to the station was a blur. Ethan's mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Images of Jamal's face, confused, scared, hopeful, flashed before him. The sound of the gunshot replayed on an endless loop. Why did I pull the trigger? The question gnawed at him, but the answer remained elusive. Was it instinct? Fear? Prejudice? He couldn't tell anymore. His chest felt like it was caving in under the weight of his guilt. The radio chirped again. Jamal Harris, 15 years old, pronounced deceased at 9:47 p.m., the dispatcher said. Ethan's stomach dropped. The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Deceased. He gripped the steering wheel harder, his fingers trembling. When Ethan arrived at the station, the atmosphere was tense. A few officers avoided his gaze as he walked in, while others gave him pointed stares. The chief, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, was waiting for him in the conference room. "Cooper," she said, her tone clipped. "Sit." He obeyed without a word, lowering himself into the chair across from her. The room felt stifling, the fluorescent lights glaring down like an interrogation lamp. "I've reviewed the initial reports," the chief began, sliding a folder across the table. "We need to go over your version of events before this escalates further." Ethan swallowed hard. "I thought—" His voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I thought he was reaching for something." The chief's expression didn't change. He wasn't armed. "I know that now," Ethan muttered, his gaze dropping to the table. "Do you?" she asked sharply. "Because out there, a boy is dead. And out there," she gestured toward the window where the faint sounds of protests were already starting to rise. "People are calling for your badge and worse." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean for this to happen." The chief leaned forward, her eyes boring into him. "Intent doesn't matter. Results do. And the result is that a 15-year-old kid is dead and the entire community is demanding justice." The words felt like daggers, but Ethan didn't argue. What could he say? Outside the station, the protests were growing. People held signs with phrases like, "Justice for Jamal" and "No more silence." Candles flickered in makeshift vigils, casting a soft glow over the crowd's hardened faces. Speakers took turns addressing the gathering. One woman, a local activist, stood on a small platform, her voice ringing out. Jamal Harris was just a kid. He should have been safe in his own neighborhood. But now, because of a split-second decision, he's gone. And we're left with the same question we've asked too many times. When will it stop? The crowd roared in agreement. Jamal's mother, tears streaming down her face, clutched a framed photo of her son. "My boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't deserve this. Inside the station, Ethan sat alone in the locker room, his head in his hands. The muffled sounds of the protest seeped through the walls, each chant piercing his conscience. Why did I assume the worst? His thoughts spiraled. He remembered a similar incident from years ago when a fellow officer had been ambushed in the same neighborhood. That memory, combined with years of hearing warnings about dangerous areas, had shaped his instincts. But now, he realized, those instincts had been poisoned by prejudice. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped to a blank page and began to write, his pen trembling. "I shot a boy tonight. He was scared, but I was more scared. And now he's gone. What does that say about me?" The words stared back at him, stark and unforgiving. As the chants outside grew louder, Ethan closed the notebook and stood. The chief's voice echoed in his mind. Results matter. The protests were no longer just about Jamal. They were about a system that allowed fear to dictate decisions and lives to be lost. Ethan knew his actions would be scrutinized, not just by the department, but by the entire community. The weight of what he had done was unbearable, but the path forward was unclear. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. As Ethan stepped out of the locker room, the sounds of the protest swelled, and he braced himself for the storm to come. The neighborhood pulsed with energy, a mix of grief and determination. What had started as quiet murmurs after Jamal's death quickly grew into a collective roar. Makeshift memorials lined the streets where the tragedy had occurred, candles flickering next to flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs of Jamal smiling. A large banner stretched across a nearby park, its message stark and unrelenting. Justice for Jamal. On the third night after the incident, hundreds gathered for a vigil. Jamal's face, printed on posters and t-shirts, stared back at those who came to mourn. The air was filled with chants demanding justice. "Say his name! Jamal Harris!" The crowd roared back. Cassandra Harris, Jamal's mother, stood at the front of the crowd, clutching a framed photo of her son. Her shoulders were stiff with resolve, despite the tears streaming down her face. "My son," Cassandra began, her voice trembling but strong, "was kind. He was brave. He believed in a better world. A world where he didn't have to be afraid of wearing a shirt that said he mattered." She paused, steadying herself against the weight of her grief. But now, that world seems farther away than ever. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices swelling with anger and sorrow. "I won't stop," she continued. "I will fight for my son until justice is served." The vigil soon gave way to larger demonstrations. By the weekend, the streets were packed with protesters. They marched in unison, holding signs and chanting slogans. No justice, no peace. Hands up, don't shoot. The tension in the air was palpable. While the majority of the crowd remained peaceful, emotions ran high, and tempers flared as they approached the police station. Officers in riot gear lined the entrance, their faces impassive, but their hands gripping shields tightly. "Stand down!" a protester yelled, pointing at the line of officers. "We're not the enemy." A brief scuffle broke out when someone from the crowd threw a plastic bottle, hitting an officer's shield. The police pushed forward slightly, their batons ready, but organizers quickly stepped in, forming a human chain to keep the two sides apart. "Stay calm," one of the organizers shouted, his voice rising above the commotion. "Don't give them a reason to silence us." Despite their best efforts, the tension only grew. A few more objects were thrown, rocks, cans, and the air thickened with unease. The police didn't charge, but their presence loomed like a storm cloud over the gathering. In the midst of the growing unrest, Cassandra Harris gave an exclusive interview to a local news station. Sitting stiffly in her living room, she spoke with raw emotion, her pain laid bare for all to see. "Jamal wasn't perfect," Cassandra admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But he was good. He was kind. He didn't deserve to be shot because someone assumed he was dangerous." The interviewer nodded solemnly. "What do you hope will come from these protests?" Cassandra's expression hardened. "Accountability," she said firmly. "I want Officer Cooper to face what he did. I want the department to admit their biases. And I want this to stop happening to our kids." Her words resonated with the community. Clips from the interview circulated online, fueling even more outrage. Cassandra became a rallying figure, her determination igniting those who were hesitant to take action. As protests continued, the community grew increasingly vocal about their distrust of the police department's investigation. They investigate themselves, one speaker declared during a rally outside City Hall. And what happens? Nothing. Every time. The crowd responded with a resounding boo, their frustration echoing through the streets. A local community leader, Angela Brooks, stepped up to the microphone. "We demand an independent investigation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need answers, and we need accountability not just for Jamal, but for every life lost because of systemic bias." The protests gained traction beyond the neighborhood, drawing attention from national media and civil rights organizations. Hashtags like "Justice for Jamal" and "Stop the Cycle" began trending, amplifying the community's message far beyond the confines of Maple Street. Inside the police station, the pressure was mounting. Ethan Cooper's name was on every headline, every protest sign. His colleagues watched him with a mix of pity and disdain, while the higher-ups scrambled to contain the damage. In an emergency press conference, Police Chief Andrea Morales addressed the public. "We are committed to conducting a thorough and impartial investigation into the events surrounding Jamal Harris's death," she said, her tone measured. "We understand the community's concerns, and we share in their grief." The crowd outside City Hall, watching the live broadcast on a massive screen, erupted in jeers. "Words mean nothing," someone yelled. "We want action," the chief continued, unshaken. "Officer Cooper has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of this investigation. We will provide updates as they become available." But the community wasn't satisfied. The lack of immediate accountability only deepened their mistrust. As the protests grew larger, so did the city's unease. Businesses boarded up their windows in anticipation of potential violence. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the night. On one particularly tense evening, a protest near the station nearly boiled over. Police formed a barricade, while protesters stood their ground. A young man with a megaphone led the chants. "They want us to go home," he yelled. "But we're not leaving until they hear us." From the other side, an officer barked orders into his radio. "Hold the line." No one advances. The standoff lasted hours, the air heavy with the threat of escalation. But once again, organizers managed to de-escalate the situation, urging everyone to remain peaceful. The protests showed no signs of slowing, but the community's demands were clear. They wanted accountability. The police department, now under intense public scrutiny, announced that an internal investigation was underway. But Cassandra Harris and her supporters weren't convinced. "We've seen this before," she told a crowd at another rally. "They investigate, they find nothing, and we're left with more questions than answers." Her words sparked a new chant among the protesters. "No more cover-ups." As the chants echoed through the streets, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the news coverage of the protests. The faces in the crowd blurred together, but one stood out: Jamal's, on a poster held high by a tearful protester. The investigation was beginning, but Ethan knew it wasn't just his actions on trial. It was the entire system he represented. And as the weight of his guilt grew heavier, he realized the road to redemption, if it even existed, would be long and unforgiving. Detective Lucas Carter arrived at the station early, the weight of the case already pressing heavily on his mind. The streets outside were still littered with signs from the previous night's protest, and the tension in the air felt almost suffocating. Carter wasn't new to high-profile cases, but this one was different. Jamal Harris wasn't just a name on paper. His story had ignited a firestorm, and it was Carter's job to find the truth amid the chaos. The first stop was evidence intake. Carter sifted through Jamal's personal effects, each item meticulously cataloged. His hands paused on a worn notebook, its edges frayed. Inside were sketches of basketball courts, notes about a school project, and folded letters that hinted at Jamal's aspirations. And then, tucked behind a loose page, was a photograph. Carter stared at it, his brow furrowing. It showed a young Jamal standing beside a man, an older, familiar-looking man. The resemblance between the man in the photo and Officer Ethan Cooper was uncanny. Carter's instincts, honed over years of investigations, kicked in. "Why would Jamal have this?" he muttered under his breath. Carter took the photo to the lab for analysis. As technicians enhanced the image, Carter reviewed the preliminary police reports. Ethan Cooper's statement claimed that he'd acted in self-defense, citing confusion and fear in the moment. But something didn't add up. Why would Jamal step toward an armed officer unless he thought he wasn't in danger? When the enhanced photo came back, Carter confirmed his suspicions. The man standing beside Jamal wasn't just someone who looked like Cooper, it was Cooper, albeit a younger version of him. The implications made Carter's stomach churn. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Carter wasted no time summoning Ethan for a preliminary interview. When the officer walked into the room, his face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. The guilt and pressure were written all over him. "Detective Carter." Ethan greeted quietly, his voice hoarse. "Officer Cooper," Carter said, gesturing for him to sit. The room was stark, the atmosphere thick with tension. After running through the formalities, Carter leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Tell me about Jamal Harris." Ethan flinched at the name, his jaw tightening. "I already gave my statement. It was a mistake, a tragic mistake." "Is that all it was?" Carter pressed, sliding the photograph across the table. "Explain this." Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at the image. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed it back. I don't know what you're implying." "You don't know?" Carter's voice rose, his frustration seeping through. "This is you with Jamal. Why would a kid you've never met have a photo of you in his belongings?" Ethan's silence was deafening. After the tense interview, Carter returned to the station's archives. He pulled Ethan's personnel file and cross-referenced it with other records. What he found raised more questions than answers. Years ago, Ethan had been assigned to a neighborhood close to where Jamal's family once lived. Carter traced property records and discovered that Ethan had rented an apartment on the same block during that time. Digging further, Carter found a name that kept resurfacing: Olivia Brown. She had once been close to Ethan, and according to old reports, she had ties to Jamal's family. As Carter pieced together the connections, the department's leadership began to push back. "Lucas," Chief Morales said during a private meeting, "I need you to tread lightly here. The media's already painting us as villains. If this investigation goes sideways—" "With all due respect, Chief," Carter interrupted, "the facts are the facts. If there's a deeper connection here, I'm not turning a blind eye just because it's inconvenient." Morales sighed, her frustration evident. "Do your job, Carter. But remember, this department doesn't need another scandal." Ignoring the mounting pressure, Carter pressed on. He tracked down Olivia Brown, who had moved out of state but maintained ties to the neighborhood. A phone call revealed that she'd once dated Ethan, but the relationship ended abruptly. "He wasn't ready for what came next," Olivia said cryptically, her voice heavy with regret. "What does that mean?" Carter asked, his pen poised over his notepad. There was a long pause before Olivia finally said, "Jamal." Carter's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you telling me Ethan Cooper is Jamal's father?" "Yes," Olivia admitted, her voice cracking. "But he didn't know. I never told him. He wasn't ready to take responsibility." The revelation hit Carter like a freight train. If Ethan truly was Jamal's father, it meant the tragedy wasn't just a product of bias and fear. It was a family's deepest fracture laid bare in the most horrific way. But Carter couldn't present this bombshell without corroboration. He obtained a DNA sample from Ethan's file and compared it to Jamal's. The results confirmed the truth. Ethan Cooper was Jamal Harris's biological father. As Carter stared at the report, he felt a mix of vindication and dread. The case had just become infinitely more complicated. Not only would the public demand justice for Jamal, but they would also demand answers about how a father could kill his own son. Carter closed the file, his mind racing. The next step would require confronting Ethan with the evidence, and the fallout would be explosive. As he prepared for what lay ahead, Carter knew one thing for certain: the truth would not stay buried for long. Detective Lucas Carter arrived at Cassandra Harris's modest home, his mind heavy with the revelations from the DNA test. He knocked on the door, the weight of what he was about to ask making the air feel thick. When Cassandra opened it, her face was pale but resolute. Her grief was evident, yet there was a fire in her eyes, a mother determined to fight for her son's justice. Cassandra invited Carter in, her voice steady but laced with pain. Detective, have you found anything? Anything that explains why that officer? She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Carter hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've come across something, but I need your help to confirm it. It's about Jamal's father. Her expression hardened, and she looked away. Why does that matter now? He wasn't a part of Jamal's life. Never was. Carter leaned forward. Cassandra, I need to know who he was. There's a photo of Jamal with a man who might be connected to what happened that night. Cassandra's jaw clenched. Jamal's father was someone I wanted to forget. He walked out before Jamal was born, said he wasn't ready to be a parent. I never looked back. Carter pushed the photo across the table. Is this him? Cassandra's eyes widened as she picked up the picture. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. That's Ethan Cooper, isn't it? The cop who... She stopped, her lips tightening into a thin line. Yes, Carter confirmed. Ethan Cooper is Jamal's biological father. Cassandra's face contorted with a mix of anger and anguish. You're telling me the man who killed my son is the same man who abandoned him before he was even born? How is that possible? I believe he didn't know, Carter said cautiously. But that doesn't excuse what happened. Cassandra let out a bitter laugh. Didn't know? That's convenient, isn't it? He didn't know when he left me, and now he didn't know when he shot Jamal. What kind of father does that? Carter could see the pain etched deeply into her face. He knew pushing her further wouldn't help, so he chose to refocus. I need to confront Ethan with this. I need to hear his side of the story. His side? Cassandra snapped. His side doesn't matter. My son is gone. I understand, Carter said, his tone calm but firm. But if we want the truth, we have to get it from him. Back at his office, Carter spread out the evidence on his desk. The photograph, the DNA results, Ethan's personnel file all pointed to the same conclusion. He stared at the photo, noting how Ethan's younger face mirrored Jamal's. The connection was undeniable, and yet it felt surreal. How could two people connected by blood end up in such a tragic confrontation? Carter knew this revelation wouldn't just impact the case, it would send shockwaves through the community and destroy what little was left of Ethan's already crumbling reputation. Carter arranged to meet Ethan at the station. When the officer entered the room, he looked worse than before. His shoulders hunched, his uniform rumpled, and his eyes hollow. Detective, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sit down, Ethan, Carter instructed, his tone sharp. We need to talk. Ethan obeyed, his movements slow and hesitant. He avoided Carter's gaze, but the detective wasn't about to let him off easy. Carter placed the photograph and DNA results on the table. Do you recognize this? Ethan froze, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What are you talking about? He said, his voice shaky. You heard me, Carter said, leaning forward. Jamal Harris, the boy you shot. He was your son, and this he tapped the DNA report proves it. Ethan shook his head violently, his voice rising. No, that's not possible. I didn't even know. Didn't know, Carter interrupted, his tone sharp. You didn't know when you abandoned Cassandra all those years ago? You didn't know when you saw a boy wearing a shirt you didn't like and decided he was a threat? I didn't abandon anyone. Ethan shot back, his voice breaking. I didn't know Cassandra was pregnant. She never told me. And that absolves you? Carter retorted. You walked away from her, from Jamal? And now you're telling me you didn't see the resemblance when you pulled that trigger? Ethan's hands trembled as he buried his face in them. I didn't see. I wasn't thinking. You let your fear and your biases guide you, Carter said coldly. And now your boy is dead because of it. Ethan slammed his fist on the table, his voice cracking. I swear I didn't know. I didn't mean for this to happen. Carter stared at him, his expression unyielding. Intent doesn't matter, Ethan. Actions do, and your actions killed your son. For a moment, the room was silent, except for Ethan's labored breathing. Then, he whispered, what am I supposed to do now? Carter leaned back, his tone softening slightly. Own up to what you've done. Face the truth. It's the only way to start making things right. Ethan nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. But Carter felt no sympathy. The damage was done, and the fallout was only beginning. As Carter left the interrogation room, he felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. The truth was out, but it wasn't enough to bring Jamal back or heal the wounds in the community. The next step was clear. Carter had to take this revelation to the public, to Cassandra, and to the protesters demanding justice. The firestorm that would follow was inevitable, but Carter was ready to face it head-on. The truth had to be heard, no matter how painful it was for everyone involved. Ethan Cooper sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the blinds drawn tight to shut out the world he no longer recognized. The photograph of Jamal and the DNA results sat on the coffee table in front of him, mocking him with an unbearable truth. His mind swirled with fragmented memories of Cassandra, of the young love he'd walked away from, and of the boy he'd never known he had. Now that boy was dead, and Ethan's trembling hand had pulled the trigger. Ethan buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the muffled hum of traffic outside. He kept replaying the moment on Maple Street, each second looping like a cruel punishment. Jamal's hesitant step forward, the flash of fear in the boy's eyes, the deafening crack of his gun firing. "Why didn't I see it?" Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. He looked at the photograph again, his eyes tracing the faint smile on Jamal's face. The resemblance was so clear now. How had he missed it in that critical moment? The weight of his failure crashed down on him. He had failed as a father, as a protector, and as a man. Every decision he'd made that night was laced with prejudice and fear, and it had cost Jamal his life. Ethan stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His face looked foreign to him, haunted, hollow, and aged by guilt. "Am I a monster?" he whispered. His mind spiraled back to the choices that had shaped him. He thought about the training drills that emphasized vigilance over compassion, the stories of danger lurking behind every unfamiliar face, and the warnings from older officers about neighborhoods like Jamal's. Those lessons had taken root in him, poisoning his judgment and warping his sense of duty. "You were supposed to protect him," he hissed at his reflection, his voice breaking. "Not kill him." But another voice, buried deeper in his mind, whispered, "Would you have hesitated if he hadn't been wearing that shirt?" The thought was like a knife twisting in his chest. The shirt. The bold BLM letters that had felt like a challenge in the heat of the moment now stared back at him as a symbol of his own failings. Ethan sat back down and pored over memories he had long buried. He remembered Cassandra, her fiery determination, and the way she had looked at him when they were younger. He had been too cowardly back then, running from the responsibility of fatherhood because he'd told himself he wasn't ready. That decision had haunted him over the years, but he'd convinced himself it was too late to make amends. And now, fate had brought him back to Cassandra and their son, but in the cruelest way possible. "This is my punishment," he whispered to himself. "I deserve this." The next morning, Ethan dragged himself to his precinct, his uniform feeling heavier than it ever had. As he walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some averted their gazes, while others stared with a mix of pity and judgment. Captain Daniels met him at his desk, her voice low and firm. "Cooper, the investigation is ongoing. You're on leave until further notice." Ethan nodded, numb. "I know." Daniels hesitated, then added, "You need to get your head straight. Whatever's going on with you, it's not just about this one moment, is it?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the blank page of a notebook. He thought about writing a letter to Cassandra, but every time he tried to start, the words seemed hollow. How could he ask for forgiveness when he didn't deserve it? How could he explain to her that he had killed their son without realizing who he was? He slammed the pen down and buried his face in his hands. His phone buzzed with a message from a friend, a fellow officer who had stood by him during tough times. The message read, "It's not all on you, man. Don't let them turn you into the villain." Ethan threw the phone across the room. The words infuriated him. He was the villain, and no amount of excuses would change that. As the hours dragged on, Ethan came to a painful realization. He couldn't keep hiding behind the walls of his apartment or the badge on his chest. He needed to face the truth and the people he had wronged. He thought of the protests swelling in the streets, of Cassandra standing at the front of the crowd demanding justice for her son. The image filled him with equal parts fear and resolve. "I can't fix what I've done," he murmured to himself, But I can't run from it either. Ethan stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out the door. He had made his decision. He would go to the community meeting scheduled for the next evening, stand before them, and confess everything. He didn't know if it would bring any peace, but it was the only thing he had left to offer. As Ethan walked into the night, his heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination. He was stepping into the lion's den, knowing full well that the people he was about to face had every reason to hate him. But he also knew that his silence would only deepen their wounds. The courtroom buzzed with tension as spectators packed the pews, their expressions a mixture of anger, grief, and quiet anticipation. The air was heavy with the weight of the case against Officer Ethan Cooper, now a symbol of the deep-seated divisions and wounds within the community. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, hands clasped tightly together. Across the room, Cassandra Harris sat upright, her gaze fixed firmly on him. There was no mistaking the pain in her eyes, but it was laced with a steely resolve. The prosecutor, a sharp and unrelenting woman named Rachel Vega, rose to deliver her opening argument. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Officer Ethan Cooper stands accused of reckless negligence, a failure in judgment that ended the life of a 15-year-old boy, Jamal Harris, a boy who wore a shirt that represented hope, not hostility. Today, we seek accountability not just for Jamal, but for a community that has suffered far too long under the weight of injustice. The crowd murmured in agreement. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening as Cassandra's quiet sobs echoed faintly from her seat. When it was her turn to take the stand, Cassandra stepped forward with a calm yet commanding presence. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. "My son, Jamal, wasn't just a boy in a shirt," she began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with every word. "He was a dreamer, a protector, and my reason to wake up every day. And now, because of one man's fear and prejudice, he's gone." She turned to face Ethan directly, her eyes locking with his. "Ethan Cooper, you took my son's life. Did you see him as a threat? Did you even see him as a person? Or was he just another face in a crowd you've been taught to fear?" Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out. Cassandra shook her head, her voice breaking as she continued. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your regret. I want you to feel the emptiness I feel every time I walk into Jamal's room and see his empty bed. I want you to understand that your actions destroyed more than just one life." When Ethan took the stand, the courtroom bristled with tension. All eyes were on him as he adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He began, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I failed. That night, I failed in every way a person can. I failed Jamal. I failed his family. And I failed the oath I swore to protect the people in my community." He paused, looking directly at Cassandra. "I didn't know Jamal was my son until after I pulled that trigger. But that doesn't change what I did. I let fear control me. I let prejudice guide me. And I can never undo the pain I've caused." The room was silent, save for the muffled sounds of people holding back tears. Ethan continued, his voice cracking. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even think I deserve it. But I'm here, willing to accept whatever punishment this court sees fit, because Jamal deserves justice." Rachel Vega wasted no time pressing Ethan during cross-examination. "Officer Cooper, you've admitted to acting out of fear. Can you tell this court what exactly you were afraid of?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "I was afraid of making the wrong decision, of losing control of the situation." "Were you afraid of Jamal specifically? A 15-year-old boy standing on a quiet street, wearing a shirt that said, 'Black Lives Matter'?" Vega pressed. Ethan swallowed hard. I wasn't thinking clearly. I made assumptions based on things I've been taught." "Things you've been taught," Vega repeated, her tone sharp. "So you're saying this isn't just about you, Officer Cooper. This is about a system that trains officers to see young black boys as threats. Is that correct?" Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but that doesn't excuse what I did." "It doesn't," Vega agreed, stepping back to let the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. After days of emotional testimony and heated arguments, the jury returned with a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver it. We find the defendant, Ethan Cooper, guilty of manslaughter. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a mix of muted cheers and angry whispers. Ethan's shoulders sagged, the reality of his fate sinking in. The judge announced his sentence: 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. Cassandra sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The sentence felt hollow. It wouldn't bring Jamal back. It wouldn't erase the pain. And it wouldn't fix the system that had allowed this tragedy to happen. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their voices rising in unison. Some called for deeper systemic changes, while others decried the sentence as too lenient. Justice for Jamal signs waved in the air, a powerful reminder that this fight wasn't over. Detective Lucas Carter stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. The trial had ended, but the case wasn't truly closed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover about the culture within the police department, about Ethan's past, and about the systems that had failed both Jamal and Ethan. The weeks following Ethan Cooper's sentencing were filled with raw tension and a cautious sense of hope. The community, still grieving the loss of Jamal Harris, demanded more than a verdict. They wanted change. City leaders, police officials, and activists convened in crowded town halls and community centers, determined to rebuild trust and prevent another tragedy. The first of many public meetings was held at a local high school gymnasium. The space was filled with members of the community, police officers, and city officials. The air buzzed with anticipation and unease as people prepared to speak their minds. Cassandra Harris took the stage, her voice steady but filled with grief. "I lost my son to fear and prejudice," she began. "But this isn't just about Jamal. It's about every child who walks these streets afraid they won't come home. It's about the officers who feel like they're walking into a war zone when they patrol our neighborhoods. We need to fix this together." The crowd erupted in applause, though there were murmurs of dissent. A young man in the back shouted, "How can we trust a system that's broken?" Officer Sarah Lopez, one of the few officers trusted in the neighborhood, stepped forward to respond. "I hear you," she said firmly. "And you're right, the system has failed. But that's why we're here. We have to start somewhere, even if it's messy and hard." Her words sparked a heated but necessary discussion. People shared their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes. For hours, stories of pain and mistrust were aired. And though the conversations were uncomfortable, they marked the first step toward reconciliation. City leaders, under immense pressure from the public, announced sweeping changes to police training and oversight. Mandatory bias training, body cameras, and an independent civilian review board were introduced as immediate measures. Chief Marcus Hale addressed the media, flanked by Cassandra and other community leaders. "Jamal Harris should be alive today," Hale said, his tone solemn. "And while we can't change the past, we can honor his memory by making sure no other family has to experience this pain." These reforms are just the beginning. Not everyone was satisfied. Some activists called the measures performative, demanding deeper systemic changes. Protesters continued to march, their chants echoing through the city streets. "No justice, no peace. Reform isn't enough." Meanwhile, officers within the department voiced their own frustrations. In a tense meeting at the precinct, some questioned the new oversight measures, while others, like Officer Lopez, defended them. "We have to earn the trust we've lost," Lopez argued. "If you're not willing to do that, maybe this isn't the job for you." Her words drew a sharp divide among the ranks, but they also ignited a necessary reckoning within the department. As the reforms were implemented, Jamal's face became a symbol of hope and change. Murals of him appeared on the sides of buildings, his bright smile framed by the words, "Justice, Unity, Hope." His story was taught in local schools as part of a broader effort to educate children about race, bias, and justice. Cassandra, though still mourning, found a new purpose. She started the Jamal Harris Foundation, dedicated to supporting youth in underserved communities and advocating for police accountability. "Jamal believed in a better world," she said during the foundation's launch event. "And I won't stop fighting until we make that world a reality." The foundation became a rallying point, drawing support from across the city. Youth programs, community workshops, and legal aid services grew under its banner. transforming Jamal's tragedy into a catalyst for meaningful change. The road to reform was not without resistance. Tensions flared during a police union meeting where some officers accused city officials of bowing to public pressure. "They're treating us like criminals," one officer complained. "We're out there risking our lives every day, and this is the thanks we get?" Detective Lucas Carter, who had become a quiet but vocal advocate for change, stood to address the room. "We can't ignore what happened to Jamal," Carter said. "Yes, this job is hard, but if we're too proud to admit when we're wrong, we'll keep making the same mistakes. We're not here to protect ourselves. We're here to protect the people." Carter's words sparked a mix of applause and grumbling, but they underscored the growing divide within the department. The battle for reform wasn't just happening in the streets. It was happening behind closed doors, in precincts and boardrooms across the city. Months later, another community meeting was held, this time with noticeable changes. Officers sat among residents rather than standing apart. Dialogues that had once been filled with shouting and accusations were now marked by cautious respect. Cassandra spoke again, her tone softer but no less determined. "We're not where we need to be," she admitted, "but we've taken steps forward. And as long as we keep walking, we'll get there." Officer Lopez, sitting beside her, nodded in agreement. Trust isn't built overnight, but it can be built. And it starts with us showing up, listening, and proving that we're here for the right reasons. The meeting ended with a standing ovation. Not for any one person, but for the collective effort to heal and rebuild. As the city moved forward, Jamal's name became a rallying cry for justice, a reminder of the cost of complacency. But for Detective Carter, the story wasn't over. There were still questions about the deeper issues within the police department, about the cultural and systemic changes needed to ensure real accountability. With the weight of the community's trust on his shoulders, Carter resolved to continue his investigation, knowing that true justice required more than reforms. It required uncovering the truths that had been buried for too long. The impact of Jamal Harris's tragic death rippled far beyond the streets of his neighborhood. His story became a symbol of the fight against injustice, igniting conversations in classrooms, boardrooms, and government offices across the country. What had begun as a local tragedy now fueled a national reckoning. Jamal's name was spoken in cities from coast to coast. Protests, vigils, and rallies were held in his honor, with banners bearing his image and the words, "Justice for Jamal." Activists, young and old, invoked his story to highlight the urgent need for systemic change. At a rally in Washington, D.C., a prominent civil rights leader took the stage, holding a photograph of Jamal. "This boy's life was taken by fear and prejudice," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But his legacy will not be one of silence. Jamal Harris reminds us that we must fight every day for a world where no child has to face such tragedy." Her words ignited the crowd. Chants of "Say his name," Jamal Harris, echoed through the streets, capturing the attention of the nation. Jamal's story became a rallying cry, not just for justice in his case, but for a broader fight against racial inequality and police misconduct. Social media amplified the movement, with hashtags like "Justice for Jamal" and "BLM Legacy" trending for weeks. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday people shared their own stories of encountering prejudice, connecting their experiences to Jamal's. Meanwhile, Ethan Cooper was serving his sentence but had not withdrawn from the world. Consumed by guilt and a deep desire to make amends, he began participating in restorative justice programs within the prison system. During one session, Ethan sat in a circle with other inmates, listening as a young black man described his own encounters with police. The man's voice was steady, but tinged with pain. "They didn't see me as a person," he said. "Just a threat, and I don't understand why." Ethan, his hands clenched tightly on his knees, finally spoke. "I was one of those officers," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I didn't see what I should have seen. And because of that, I took a life. I'm sorry isn't enough, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." His confession was met with silence, followed by nods of acknowledgement. While forgiveness wasn't immediate, the act of taking accountability marked a turning point in Ethan's journey. Later, Ethan began working with advocacy groups focused on addressing implicit bias in law enforcement. He recorded a video message that was used in training programs, addressing cadets directly. "Don't be like me," he said. "Challenge your assumptions. Question your fears. Because once you pull that trigger, you can't take it back. And no amount of regret will undo the harm you've caused." Though controversial, Ethan's efforts gained attention. Some praised him for taking responsibility, while others criticized him, saying it was too little, too late. But Ethan pressed on, knowing that his actions now could prevent others from making the same mistakes. Cassandra Harris continued to be the heart of the movement. She traveled the country, speaking at universities, community events, and government hearings. Her words were a blend of sorrow and resolve. "Jamal was my son," she often began, her voice filled with quiet strength. "But he was also your son, your brother, your neighbor. What happened to him should never happen to anyone, anywhere." Cassandra's advocacy extended beyond the personal. She worked with lawmakers to push for police reform legislation, including measures for accountability and transparency. At a Senate hearing, she stood before a panel of lawmakers, holding the shirt Jamal had worn that night. "This was just a shirt," she said. "But to the man who killed my son, it was a threat." That's what we need to change, not just the policies, but the perceptions. Her testimony brought many to tears and spurred action. A bill named the Jamal Harris Act was introduced, aimed at increasing funding for community policing programs and mandating anti-bias training for officers nationwide. In Jamal's neighborhood, his name became synonymous with hope and resilience. A mural was painted on the side of a community center, showing Jamal with a radiant smile, his hands raised toward the sky. Beneath it were the words, "Injustice. Anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Young people gathered at the mural to hold discussions about race and equality, inspired by Jamal's courage. Local schools implemented programs to teach students about civil rights and community activism. "He was just a kid," a teacher said during one such session, "but he had the heart of a giant. Let's honor him by building a world where kids like Jamal can thrive." The Jamal Harris Foundation, led by Cassandra, expanded its reach, funding scholarships for students who aspired to become lawyers, teachers, and community leaders. Despite the progress, the journey was far from over. Cassandra reminded everyone that Jamal's story was one of many. During a television interview, she said, "Jamal is a symbol, yes, but symbols can only take us so far. It's what we do next that matters. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, because the moment we stop, the cycle repeats." Detective Lucas Carter, still working to uncover systemic issues within the police department, echoed this sentiment in his own way. During an internal meeting, he told his peers, "If Jamal's death doesn't wake us up, then nothing will. We have to confront our flaws, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us." As the years passed, Jamal's legacy only grew stronger. His story became a case study in universities, a topic of debate in political campaigns, and a reminder of the cost of complacency. But for those closest to him, like Cassandra and Ethan, it was a deeply personal reminder of the importance of action. As Cassandra often said, "Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey." And Jamal's story has shown us the way forward. With the seeds of reform taking root and the conversation around justice continuing to evolve, the next chapter of this story was yet to be written. The community of Maple Street was forever changed by the tragedy of Jamal Harris. The scars of that fateful night lingered, but they also served as a constant reminder of the work still to be done. Over time, the neighborhood began to rebuild not just its fractured trust, but also its sense of shared purpose. On a brisk autumn evening, months after the trial, the community gathered once more at the site of the mural honoring Jamal. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding candles, others clutching signs that read, "Never forget, and justice lives on." Cassandra Harris stood at the forefront, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "Jamal's life was taken from us, but his spirit remains," she said. "Every step we take toward justice is a step toward honoring his memory." But justice isn't just about laws or policies. It's about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other. Her words resonated deeply. Among the crowd was Ethan Cooper, standing silently in the back. He had been released on parole after serving part of his sentence, and his presence was a source of mixed emotions. Some still regarded him with anger, while others saw him as a man trying to right his wrongs. Ethan approached Cassandra cautiously after her speech. The two had spoken briefly during his trial, but this was the first time they stood face to face outside a courtroom. "I don't expect forgiveness," Ethan began, his voice strained. "But I need you to know that I carry this every day. I'll never stop trying to make amends." Cassandra regarded him for a long moment. Her eyes, filled with both sorrow and strength, locked onto his. "Ethan, forgiveness isn't something I can give you in a moment. It's a journey for both of us. But if you're sincere in your efforts, then maybe one day we can find some peace." Ethan nodded, her words striking deeper than he expected. "I want to help, in whatever way I can. I know it'll never be enough, but I have to try." Cassandra didn't reply immediately. Instead, she placed a hand on the mural of her son, her fingers tracing the outline of his painted smile. "Start by listening," she finally said. "Listen to this community. Hear their pain. That's the only way you'll understand." In the wake of Jamal's death, the residents of Maple Street began working together in ways they never had before. Weekly town hall meetings became a cornerstone of their efforts, where people of all backgrounds gathered to discuss issues, share experiences, and propose solutions. One heated meeting centered around police reform. Officers from the local precinct were invited to listen as community members shared their stories. One young man stood and addressed the room. "I've been stopped by police more times than I can count, just because of the color of my skin," he said. "But we're not here to fight you. We're here to be heard, to make things better." Detective Lucas Carter, who had attended as both a listener and a participant, stood up in response. "We hear you," he said, "and we have to do better. This isn't just about one tragedy. It's about making sure it never happens again." Carter's words marked a turning point. The department introduced new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. Officers began engaging more actively with the community, attending block parties, school events, and mentorship programs. While skepticism remained, the seeds of trust were being sown. For Cassandra, the greatest lesson was that change required persistence and unity. She continued her advocacy work, traveling to schools and communities to share Jamal's story. During one such visit, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you think the world will ever be fair?" Cassandra smiled gently, though her heart ached. "Fairness isn't something that just happens," she said. "It's something we have to fight for every day. But with people like you, I believe we can get closer." Ethan, too, was learning. His work with advocacy groups brought him face to face with families who had suffered similar losses. Each story he heard deepened his understanding of the pain he had caused and strengthened his resolve to be part of the solution. During one meeting, an activist confronted him directly. "You think showing up and talking about your mistakes fixes anything?" she demanded. Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. "No, I don't. But I'm not here to fix things. I'm here to take responsibility and to help where I can." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Then, a man in the back spoke up. "Accountability matters," he said, "but so does action. Let's see what he does next." The mural of Jamal became a gathering place, not just for mourning, but for hope. Children played beneath it, families left flowers and notes, and activists used it as a backdrop for rallies. One day, a young boy approached Cassandra at the mural. "Miss Harris," he said, clutching a drawing of Jamal. "I want to be like him when I grow up." Cassandra knelt down, her eyes filling with tears. "You already are," she said softly. Jamal's story became part of the school curriculum, a case study in activism and the cost of prejudice. His name was etched into scholarships, community programs, and even a bill passed by the state legislature aimed at improving police accountability. As the community continued its journey, it was clear that the work was far from over. Discrimination and fear still lingered, but so did hope. At another town hall, Carter addressed the room with a final thought. "Change isn't a straight path," he said. "It's messy, it's painful, and it takes time. But as long as we keep walking, we'll get there." Ethan, sitting quietly in the back, nodded to himself. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could honor Jamal's memory by being better each day. Cassandra, standing by the mural later that evening, placed her hand over her heart. "This isn't the end," she whispered. "It's just the beginning." Jamal's story reminds us that the fight for justice and equality isn't just about policies. It's about the choices we make, the conversations we have, and the actions we take every single day. His legacy challenges us to look inward, to confront our own biases, and to ask ourselves, what can we do to ensure a tragedy like this never happens again? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How would you start building a better, more understanding community? Share your ideas in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive and create the change we want to see. Thank you for watching.
The road stretched ahead, flanked by rolling hills and distant woods that seemed to hum with an uneasy quiet. Marcus Hayes gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against his deep brown skin. The town of Willow Creek was only a few miles away, but the weight of his mission felt heavier with each passing mile. He glanced at the rear-view mirror. No cars. Just open road. It should have been a peaceful drive, but Marcus couldn't shake the tension coiling in his chest. He'd been here before, in more ways than one. A new town. A new precinct. A system in desperate need of reform. This time, though, it felt personal in a way he couldn't yet explain. Suddenly, the flash of red and blue lights erupted behind him, piercing the solitude. The wail of a siren followed, sharp and accusatory. Marcus sighed, his heart sinking. He slowed to a stop on the gravel shoulder and rolled down his window as a patrol car pulled up behind him. Two officers approached. One was stocky, with a face that seemed permanently etched with disdain. The other was tall and wiry, his gait casual but menacing. The stocky one rapped on the window with unnecessary force. "License and registration," he barked, not even glancing at Marcus before his eyes darted toward the interior of the car. Marcus nodded and handed over his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Yeah, there's a problem," the taller officer interjected, leaning down to peer into the car. His badge read McCall. "You're driving through here like you own the place. What's your business in Willow Creek?" Marcus met McCall's eyes calmly. "I'm here for work." "Work, huh?" McCall smirked, nudging his partner. "Hear that, Davis? He's got work in our town. Bet he's a salesman or something." Davis snorted. "Nah, he's dressed too nice for that. Maybe a lawyer? One of those big city types who thinks he can roll into a place like this and throw his weight around." "I'm neither," Marcus replied evenly. "Is that right?" Davis leaned closer, his tone sharpening. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Marcus hesitated, but he knew better than to argue. He exited the car slowly, standing tall despite the simmering humiliation bubbling in his chest. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," McCall ordered. Marcus complied, feeling the cold metal against his palms as they began to pat him down. "This really necessary?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing heat in his face. Davis chuckled. "Yeah, it's necessary. Can't be too careful with outsiders. You understand. You sure you don't have anything in here you shouldn't?" McCall asked, opening the driver's side door and rifling through the glove compartment. "Only what's in the registration," Marcus replied. Davis pulled out Marcus's wallet and inspected his ID with a mock whistle. "Marcus Hayes. Sounds real official. You running for office or something?" "No." McCall emerged from the car, holding a neatly packed duffel bag. He unzipped it and began pulling out clothes and personal items, tossing them carelessly onto the ground. "Hey," Marcus said, his composure finally slipping. "That's unnecessary." McCall sneered. "I'll decide what's necessary." Davis laughed, kicking at one of Marcus's shirts. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Most people just keep their mouths shut." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Are we done here?" McCall stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Done? Not until I say so. But you've got that look, you know? Like you think you're better than us. Let me tell you something. Around here, respect is earned." "And I intend to earn it," Marcus replied, his voice firmer now. McCall tilted his head, momentarily thrown off by the response. Then he shrugged. "You've got a smart mouth, Hayes. Watch yourself in this town." Davis tossed the wallet back onto the hood of the car. You're free to go. For now. Marcus gathered his scattered belongings, stuffing them back into the duffel bag with measured movements. He climbed back into his car, his face impassive but his hands trembling. As he drove away, the two officers stood in his rearview mirror, laughing and shaking their heads. The tension in the precinct was palpable the moment Marcus walked through the front doors. The building was small but busy, a hub of activity with officers bustling from desk to desk. Conversations stilled as heads turned, and whispers filled the air like static. Henderson, the interim sheriff, stood by the main desk, his bulk filling the space as he chewed on a toothpick. His eyes narrowed when Marcus approached. "You lost?" Henderson asked, his southern drawl thick with condescension. "No," Marcus said, setting his duffel bag on the desk. "I'm Marcus Hayes, the new chief of police." The room fell silent. Henderson's toothpick froze mid-chew, and his brow furrowed. "Come again." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and produced a letter of appointment, signed and stamped by the state. He placed it on the desk in front of Henderson. "I'll be taking over starting today," Marcus said, his tone calm but authoritative. Henderson's face twisted into a sneer. "Well, ain't that something? Guess they didn't mention that to me." "Apparently not," Marcus replied. McCall and Davis entered the precinct at that moment, their laughter dying abruptly when they saw Marcus standing at the desk. Their faces turned ashen as realization dawned. "You've got to be kidding me," McCall muttered under his breath. Davis stared, his mouth agape. "He's the new chief." Marcus turned to them, his gaze steady. "It's good to see you again. I trust we'll have no further misunderstandings." McCall clenched his jaw but said nothing. Henderson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, Chief," he said, the word dripping with disdain, "this is a small town. We do things a certain way here. You'll find it's best not to stir the pot too much." Marcus met his gaze head-on. "And I'm here to make sure the pot gets stirred." The room was silent once more, the air thick with tension. Marcus picked up his duffel bag and turned to address the gathered officers. "I know my presence here might come as a surprise," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "But I'm not here to make friends or enemies. I'm here to ensure this precinct serves the people of Willow Creek with integrity and fairness. That's the job, and I expect every one of you to do it." He didn't wait for a response. He walked past the stunned officers and into his new office, closing the door behind him. For a moment, he stood in the quiet, staring out the window at the small, bustling town beyond. He let out a slow breath, steadying himself. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Marcus Hayes had always known how to find strength in adversity. And he wasn't about to stop now. Marcus chegou cedo ao seu escritorio no dia seguinte. A noite anterior fora misto de reflexo e planejamento, mas também de inquietaco. Ele sabia que sua presença Willow Creek havia abalado a dinâmica de delegacia, e o desconforto no ambiente era tão palpável quanto esperado. Os sons de manhã preenchiam o prédio, telephones tocando, conversas abafadas e o som ritmado de teclas sendo pressionadas. Apesar disso, os olhares furtivos e as conversas interrompidas quando Marcus passava indicavam que ele não era bem-vindo ali. Ele se preparou para o primeiro passo de sua estratégia, observação. Antes de agir, precisava entender como tudo realmente funcionava por ali. Enquanto ajustava papias sua mesa, ouviu uma batida livre na porta. "Entre", disse, sem levantar os olhos. Rachel Flores, uma jovem policial de origem latina, entrou hesitant. Ela parecia tensa, mas determinada. "Delegado Hayes." Cômico, a voz firme apesar de hesitação. "Sou Rachel Flores. Trabalho aqui há 2 anos. So queria-me apresentar oficialmente e dar as boas-vindas." Marcus olhou para ela e viu algo que não era como nos outros oficiais que havia encontrado até agora, sinceridade. Ele estendeu a mão, e Rachel apertou-a com firmeza. "Obrigado, oficial Flores. E BLM conhecer alguém disposto a dar as boas-vindas. Não tem sido exatamente uma recepção calorosa." Ela soltou sorriso sem graça. "Honestamente, o senhor está me sendo number vespero." Muito tempo que essa delegacia opera, do jeito deles. Muitos aqui esteo mais preocupados em manter as coisas como esteo do que seguir o que é certo. E você? Marcus perguntou, inclinando-se levemente para a frente. Onde você se encaixa nisso? Rachel hesitou, mas respondeu com honestidade. Quero fazer o meu trabalho direito, senhor. Neo sou perfeita, mas neo consigo fechar os olhos para o que acontece aqui. Antes que pudessem continuar a conversa, houve uma batida mais passada na porta, seguida pela entrada abrupta de Henderson, sem esperar permissão. Preciso falar com você, chefe, disse Henderson, com sarcasmo evidente na última palavra. Lançou olhar desconfiado para Rachel, que rapidamente saiu, dizendo a seus. Pois neo, Henderson? Marcus respondeu, sem demonstrar incomodo como interrupco. Henderson fechou a porta atrás de e cruzou os bracos. Vamos direito ao ponto. Você tem boas intenções, e eu dou isso a você. Mas esse lugar neo é o que você pensa. As pessoas aqui são complicadas. Elas neo gostam de mudanças. Marcus se recostou na cadeira, cruzando as mãos sobre a mesa. Paris mais aviso do que uma conversa. Henderson sorriu de lado. Talvez seja. Quero poupar você de problemas. Neo precisa se meter tudo. Faca su trabalho. Sueda das aparências e deixo o resto para que mantendo terreno. Marcus permaneceu calmo, mas sua voz ganhou tom mais firme. Meu trabalho neo é só cuidar das aparências, Henderson. E quem acha que entendo terreno talvez precise começar a aprender novo mapa. Henderson riu, mas havia tenseo por trás do som. Como quiser, chefe. So neo diga que eu neo avise. Ele saiu, batendo a porta com força. Marcus respirou fundo, dizendo a conversa a center sua mente. Henderson havia acabado de confirmar o que ele já sabia. A resistência síria aberta e constante. Mais tarde, Marcus saiu para patrulhar a cidade. Ele queria ver Willow Creek com seus próprios olhos, além das paredes da delegacia. Caminhou pelas ruas principais, parando para conversar com moradores e observar a dinâmica da comunidade. Uma lancanite no centro, ele encontrou Sarah Coleman, uma líder comunitária local que era conhecida por sua postura crítica relação à polícia. Ela estava sentada uma mesa próxima à janela, lendo jornal local. Posso me sentar? Marcus perguntou, parando ao lado da mesa. Sarah levantou os olhos, avaliando-o cuidadosamente. Neo e tudo dia que o delegado vem pessoalmente, sem sirens e algemas. Marcus sorriu levemente e se sentou. Quero entender a cidade, ouvir as pessoas. Sei que a relação entre a polícia e a comunidade aqui neo é das melhores. Sarah soltou uma risada curta. Neo das melhores é eufemismo. Aqui, delegado, a polícia neo é vista como protetora. É mais uma força de opresso, especialmente para quem é pobre ou de cor. Marcus assentiu, sem se ofender. É exatamente por isso que estou aqui. Quero mudar isso. Sarah arquiu uma sobrancelha, cética. Já ouvi promessas assim antes. Palavras bonitas. Mas no fim, sempre acaba do mesmo jeito. Antes que Marcus pudesse responder, barulho alto chamou sua atenção. Do lado de fora, Davis e McCall estavam discutindo com jovem negro na calçada. O rapaz, claramente nervoso, gesticulava enquanto os dois oficiais o cercavam. Marcus se levantou rapidamente. Espere, disse Sarah. Não vale a pena se envolver. Mas Marcus já estava na porta. Se aproximar, ouviu a conversa. Diz que o casaco era meio cara. O jovem insistia, segurando moltom desgastado. Paris roubado para mim, McCall respondeu, sorrindo de maneira ameaçadora. Davis avançou passo. Você quer resolver isso aqui ou na delegacia? Tem algum problema aqui? Marcus interrompeu, Sua vos cortante como uma lamina. Os dois policiais se viraram, surpresos. Delegado, McCall disse, ajustando o chapéu. So lidando com uma situação. Esse garoto aqui está se fazendo do esperto. E mesmo. Marcus perguntou, olhando diretamente para o jovem. O que está acontecendo? O rapaz engoliu seco, olhando para McCall antes de responder. Eles acham que rubiai esse casaco, moçameu. Ele neo tem recibo, delegado, Davis interveio, a voz carregada de sarcasmo. Paris suspeito, neo acha? Marcus cruzu os bracos, encarando os dois policiais. Vocês tem alguma evidência de que ele rubu o casaco? BLM, neo exatamente, mas, comico McCall, mas Marcus o interrompu. Enteo vocês neo tem motivo para dit-lo. Dixam o rapaz ir. Os dois oficiais trocaram olhares, claramente irritados, mas requaram. Claro, chief. Do jeito que quiser, McCall disse, com sorriso falso antes de se virar ser. Davis seguiu, murmurando algo que Marcus neo conseguiu ver, mas que neo parecia nada amigável. Marcus voltou-se para o jovem. Está tudo bem agora. Qual é o seu nome? Tyler, o rapaz respondeu, ainda nervoso. Tyler, se você tiver algum problema com esses dois novamente, venha direito à delegacia. Pergunte por mim, Marcus Hayes. Tyler assentiu, agradecendo antes de ser apressado. Quando Marcus voltou para a lancanete, Sarah o observava com misto de surpresa e respeito. Talvez você seja diferente, e final. Marcus neo respondeu de imediato, apenas olhou para a rua onde Tyler havia desaparecido. Ser diferente neo é suficiente. Quero resultados. Sarah assentiu lentamente, como esse comcaça creditor, ainda que com cautela. O trabalho estava apenas começando, e Marcus sabia que, para transformar Willow Creek, precisaria conquistar tanto a confiança da comunidade quanto desmantelar o sistema corrompido que operava dentro de sua própria delegacia. Marcus sat alone in his office late at night, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above his desk the only sound in the otherwise silent precinct. The day's events had been a reminder of how deep the rot in Willow Creek ran. It wasn't just the system, it was the people who perpetuated it, the ones who believed their power gave them the right to wield fear and humiliation as tools. His eyes fell on a file spread across his desk. It was a summary of the department's disciplinary records, or lack thereof. Cases of misconduct were noted, then dismissed with suspicious regularity. Complaints from citizens disappeared into bureaucratic oblivion, leaving no trace of accountability. Marcus's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. The names Davis and McCall appeared repeatedly, along with Henderson's signature on every dismissal form. A knock on his door broke his focus. "Come in," Marcus called, straightening in his chair. Rachel Flores entered cautiously, a stack of papers in her hands. "Sorry to bother you, sir. I thought you might want to see these." "What are they?" She set the papers on his desk. "Old reports. I found them buried in the archives. Well, they're not pretty." Marcus skimmed the top sheet, his eyebrows furrowing. The report detailed a traffic stop from 10 years ago. A young black man had been pulled over and assaulted by 2 officers. The victim had filed a complaint, but the investigation was quietly closed. The names of the officers? Davis and McCall. "This isn't surprising," Marcus said, his voice measured. "But it's useful." Rachel hesitated, then added, "There's more. I was looking for patterns in the complaints, and I found one that might interest you." She handed him another file, older and more weathered. Marcus opened it and froze. The name on the report leaped out at him, Marcus Hayes. The memories came flooding back like a tidal wave. He was 17 again, standing on the cracked pavement of a city street, the summer heat pressing down like a weight. 2 officers had pinned him against a car, their voices sharp and mocking. "You look like trouble," one of them had said, his grip on Marcus's arm painfully tight. "I didn't do anything," Marcus had protested, his voice shaking. The second officer had laughed, a cruel sound that still echoed in Marcus's mind. "That's what they all say." The assault that followed was quick but brutal. Shoves, fists, and kicks delivered with casual cruelty. When it was over, Marcus had been left bruised and humiliated, the officers laughing as they drove away. He had never reported it. At the time, he believed it would do more harm than good. Complaining about the police, as a young black man, felt like signing a death warrant for his future. But now, holding the file in his hands, Marcus felt a fire ignite in his chest. The report was incomplete, filled with vague descriptions and no follow-up. Still, it was enough to confirm what he had suspected for years. The assault had been documented but buried, just like so many others. "Are you okay?" Rachel's voice pulled him back to the present. Marcus closed the file carefully, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you for bringing this to me." Rachel hesitated, sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "If you need anything else, let me know." As she left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had buried this part of himself for years, locking it away to focus on his career and his mission. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, demanding to be reckoned with. The next morning, Marcus called a meeting with the entire precinct. The officers filed into the room reluctantly, their expressions ranging from annoyance to curiosity. Henderson took a seat in the back, his arms crossed, while McCall and Davis stood near the door, whispering to each other. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "I've been reviewing the department's records, and I found some concerning patterns." A ripple of unease passed through the room. "For too long, this precinct has operated without accountability," Marcus continued. "Complaints from citizens are ignored, misconduct is swept under the rug, and the community we're supposed to serve has lost all trust in us. That changes now." McCall smirked. "And how exactly are you planning to do that?" Marcus's gaze locked onto him. "By ensuring that everyone in this room is held to the same standard of integrity. If you can't uphold the values of this department, you don't belong here." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you'll be the one to decide who stays and who goes." "No," Marcus replied evenly. "The evidence will decide. And I've already found plenty." He picked up a stack of files from the podium and held them up. "These are complaints that were dismissed without investigation. I'll be reopening each of them and ensuring they're handled properly." McCall's smirk faltered, and Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Transparency starts now," Marcus said. "And that includes reviewing the actions of every officer in this room, including myself." The room erupted into murmurs. "Including yourself?" Henderson asked, his tone skeptical. Marcus met his gaze. "Yes. I've been a victim of this system, but I'm also a part of it. If I've made mistakes, they'll come to light. No one is above accountability." The murmurs grew louder, a mix of surprise and skepticism. Marcus knew he was treading dangerous ground, but he didn't flinch. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he continued. "It's about making things right. I want to work with all of you to rebuild this department into something we can be proud of. But if you're not willing to be part of that change, I suggest you step aside now." The room fell silent once more, the weight of his words settling over the officers like a heavy fog. Later that day, Marcus received an anonymous note on his desk. The handwriting was messy, the words hastily scrawled. "Dig too deep, and you won't like what you find." Marcus stared at the note for a long moment before folding it and slipping it into his pocket. The warning was clear, but it only strengthened his resolve. He knew the path ahead would be treacherous, and he would face resistance from every direction. But Marcus Hayes had spent his entire life standing up against the odds, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he looked out the window at the quiet streets of Willow Creek, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. The precinct felt different in the days following Marcus's meeting. Some officers avoided eye contact, while others moved with barely concealed hostility. Whispers filled the halls, and the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Marcus worked silently, observing, noting, and preparing. Change didn't happen overnight, and he knew the resistance he faced now was only the beginning. That morning, Rachel Flores walked into Marcus's office with a folder in her hands and a look of concern on her face. "Sir," she began, closing the door behind her, "I think you need to see this." Marcus motioned for her to sit and took the folder. Inside were recent arrest reports, all signed by Davis and McCall. The details were troubling. Minor infractions blown out of proportion, excessive force, and vague justifications for detentions. They're targeting specific groups, Rachel said, her voice low. Young men, mostly black and Latino. I've seen it happen, but no one ever speaks up because they know nothing will change. Marcus's jaw tightened as he scanned the reports. The patterns were undeniable. This is exactly the kind of behavior I'm here to stop, he said. Rachel hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, calling them out might not be enough. They're not just bending the rules, they're breaking them. And if they feel cornered, they might retaliate. Marcus looked up at her, his expression resolute. Then we'll deal with it. But I won't let this continue. Later that day, Marcus called Davis and McCall into his office. The two officers entered, their postures stiff and defensive. McCall leaned casually against the doorframe, his smirk firmly in place, while Davis stood with his arms crossed, a scowl on his face. You wanted to see us, Chief? McCall drawled, emphasizing the title with mock respect. Marcus gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. Sit. Neither moved. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That wasn't a suggestion. Reluctantly, they sat, their expressions unchanged. Marcus opened one of the reports from Rachel's folder and placed it on the desk between them. Explain this, he said, his tone calm but cold. Davis glanced at the report, then back at Marcus. It's an arrest report. What's the problem? The problem, Marcus said, leaning forward, is that it's one of many reports showing a pattern of excessive force and questionable arrests. Care to explain why your arrest rates are disproportionately higher than anyone else's in this precinct? McCall scoffed. We're just doing our jobs. Maybe the others should take notes. Marcus didn't flinch. Your job doesn't include harassment or abuse of power. These reports suggest otherwise. Davis shifted uncomfortably. Look, sometimes you've got to be tough to keep the peace. These kids don't respect authority. They push, we push back. Marcus's voice hardened. And what about the ones who don't push? What about the ones who just want to live their lives without being harassed by the people who are supposed to protect them? McCall's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Is that all, Chief? Because we've got real work to do. Marcus stood, his presence towering over them. Let me be clear, this stops now. Any further misconduct will be met with disciplinary action, up to and including termination. Do I make myself clear? Davis and McCall exchanged a glance. Davis looked ready to argue, but McCall nudged him and stood. Crystal clear, McCall said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. As they left, Marcus watched them carefully. He could see the defiance in their eyes, the unwillingness to change. They wouldn't back down easily, but neither would he. That evening, Marcus drove through one of Willow Creek's poorer neighborhoods. The streets were quiet, lined with modest homes and overgrown lawns. He parked his car and walked, wanting to see the community he was trying to protect. As he turned a corner, he spotted a group of teenagers gathered near a basketball hoop in a cracked driveway. They stopped their game as he approached, their eyes wary. Evening, Marcus said, keeping his tone light. One of the boys, tall and lean with a protective stance, stepped forward. You lost or something? Marcus shook his head. No. Just wanted to say hello. The boy crossed his arms. You a cop? Marcus nodded. I am. Marcus Hayes, the new chief of police. The group exchanged glances, skepticism etched on their faces. Why you here? Another boy asked, his tone more curious than hostile. Because I want to understand this community, Marcus said. And because I know things haven't been fair for people like you. The tall boy frowned. Like us. Marcus nodded. Yeah. I know what it's like to feel targeted just for being who you are. And I know that's been happening here. I'm trying to change that. The group fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. You really think you can? The tall boy asked, his voice quieter now. I don't just think so, Marcus said. I know so. But I can't do it alone. The boy studied him for a long moment before nodding. Guess we'll see. When Marcus returned to the precinct, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message. "Stay in your lane, or you'll end up like the last one." Marcus stared at the note, his expression unreadable. He knew the last one referred to the former chief, whose abrupt resignation had been shrouded in mystery. He folded the note and placed it in his drawer. The threat didn't surprise him, but it reinforced the gravity of his mission. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. But Marcus Hayes had never been one to back down from a fight. The days following the anonymous threat were a whirlwind of tension and strategy. Marcus knew he couldn't confront the corruption in Willow Creek on his own. To dismantle the system, he needed evidence, allies, and, most importantly, the trust of the community. Rachel Flores became his closest confidant, helping him sift through years of buried complaints and overlooked misconduct. Together, they began piecing together a picture of systemic abuse, with Henderson, Davis, and McCall at the center. The breakthrough came when Marcus uncovered financial records linking Henderson to local business owners. Bribes disguised as community donations flowed through the precinct, funding Henderson's lavish lifestyle while shielding the businesses from scrutiny. The same records revealed payments to Davis and McCall, bonuses for enforcing Henderson's will and keeping dissidents quiet. It was damning evidence, but Marcus knew it wasn't enough. He needed to expose the corruption publicly, to force accountability in a way that couldn't be ignored. One night, Marcus called a town hall meeting. The announcement spread quickly, and by the time the meeting began, the community center was packed. Residents filled the rows of chairs, while others stood along the walls, their faces etched with a mix of hope and skepticism. Marcus stood at the front of the room, flanked by Rachel and a few younger officers who had pledged their support. He began by acknowledging the pain and mistrust that had defined the community's relationship with the police. "For years, this precinct has failed you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know many of you have been hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect you. And I know words alone won't fix that." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But tonight, I'm not here to offer empty promises. I'm here to tell you the truth." Marcus revealed the financial records, the misconduct reports, and the web of corruption that had allowed Henderson and his loyal officers to operate with impunity. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he detailed the abuse of power, the cover-ups, and the complicity that had poisoned the system. "This isn't just about a few bad officers," Marcus continued. "It's about a culture that prioritizes power over justice. And it's going to take all of us to change that." The room was silent for a moment before Sarah Coleman, the community leader Marcus had met earlier, stood. "Why should we believe you?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. "What makes you any different?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression open. "Because I've been where you are," he said. "I've been on the receiving end of injustice. And because I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, I'm asking you to hold me accountable. To hold all of us accountable." The room erupted into applause, a tentative but hopeful sound. The fallout was swift and chaotic. Henderson, Davis, and McCall were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The state launched a formal inquiry into the precinct, and Marcus worked tirelessly to ensure that every piece of evidence was turned over to the appropriate authorities. There were moments of backlash. Anonymous threats escalated, and Marcus was forced to tighten security measures for himself and his team. But for every obstacle, there was progress. Officers who had been silent out of fear began speaking out, and the community started to rally behind Marcus's vision for change. Months later, Willow Creek was a different place. The investigation had led to multiple arrests, including Henderson, Davis, and McCall. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul, with new policies emphasizing transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Rachel Flores was promoted to deputy chief, becoming a symbol of the precinct's commitment to diversity and fairness. Together, she and Marcus implemented programs to rebuild trust, including regular town halls, community patrols, and mentorship initiatives for local youth. Marcus's personal journey also came full circle. He shared his own story of police brutality in an interview with a local newspaper, sparking a larger conversation about systemic racism and the need for reform. His vulnerability inspired others to come forward with their experiences, creating a groundswell of support for change. On a crisp autumn evening, Marcus stood outside the precinct, watching as the sun set over the town he had come to call home. Sarah Coleman joined him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. You did it, she said simply. We did it, Marcus corrected, a small smile playing at his lips. Sarah nodded, looking out at the horizon. Still a long way to go. There always is, Marcus said. But now we're moving in the right direction. The story of Willow Creek spread beyond the small town, inspiring other communities to confront corruption and demand better from their leaders. Marcus Hayes became a symbol of integrity and resilience, proof that change was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the town continued to heal, Marcus remained steadfast in his commitment to justice, knowing that the fight was never truly over, but also that it was always worth it.